Now a discussion on the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia. The Cato Institute hosted a forum on the issue today in Washington. During this portion of the event, participants debate whether the military is needed to defend Persian Gulf oil. It's about 90 minutes.
Good morning and welcome to the Cato Institute. I'm Bill Niskanen, the chairman of Cato and the moderator of this first panel. The question before this first panel is whether the United States needs to maintain a military presence in the Middle East, and specifically in Saudi Arabia, in order to assure our access to Persian Gulf oil. Now, this is an issue in which I have written and I have very strong views myself. I will manage to suppress those views until we hear from this morning's experts. But this is an important topic, at least since the time of the Gulf War. The American government has occasionally used the access to oil as at least one of the rationalizations for our military presence over there. And so that's the issue before us this morning. Our first presenter is Don Losman. He's the professor of economics at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at the National Defense University, where he specializes in macroeconomics, economic warfare, and defense industrial base issues. Each of our speakers will have 12 to 15 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion among themselves and with the audience after that time. After 15 minutes, they will be kneecapped. Don, you're on.
Thank you. Good morning. Our nation suffers from a severe psychological disorder. I call it petrol-phobia, which I define as the acute fear of oil deprivation and its presumed catastrophic consequences. Like all psychological disorders, petrol-phobia stems from events in our past. Although it biases our behavior and we find it burdensome, we've become quite comfortable living with petrol-phobia, resisting obvious logical policies which would clearly minimize the ounce of truth in our cherished pound of pain. Further, petrol-phobia, as with other emotional disorders, drives us to policies that could easily court the very disaster which we so greatly fear. Petrol-phobia rests on three erroneous assumptions which have been universally embraced. The first cites the economic debacle of the 1970s, the rampant inflation, falling productivity, rising unemployment, sky-high interest rates, etc., all of which are deemed a direct result of the 1973 oil embargo and associated price hikes. Second assumption, we are just as vulnerable today, if not more so, and are thus courting another economic disaster. And the third, our best hope of avoiding economic catastrophe is a strong military presence in the Middle East associated with strong diplomatic and political support for Middle East oil exporting states. I would maintain that all three assumptions are almost entirely wrong. Let's start with the belief that the economic disaster of the 1970s was totally or mainly due to oil denial/oil disruption. In point of fact, the debacle of the 1970s was set into motion well before 1973. The inflation genie was already so well out of the bottle that the president invoked our nation's first peacetime wage price controls over 2 years prior to the embargo. While oil price hikes should have changed relative prices and perhaps generated intermittent step increases in the general price level, the continuing inflation of that decade was policy-driven, domestic policy, a point on which both Milton Friedman and John Kenneth Galbraith agree. It was the distortions which that rapacious inflation brought that were far and away the most significant causal factor of that decade's disastrous economic performance. The second major factor was our inappropriate energy policy responses to the oil price hikes themselves. Nor was the October 1973 war the root cause of Arab oil actions. Indeed, a reading of the region's history shows that, with the exception of some foolish economic nationalism, the main oil players have consistently been rational economic actors, motivated by their perceived pecuniary benefits. Where they can also score political points, they're happy to do so. For example, since OPEC oil delegates were already negotiating in Vienna for another price hike when the October 1973 war broke out, it was very convenient for Arab producers to fly the flag of Arab angst. But cash on the barrelhead regularly trumps Arab solidarity or anti-Israel, anti-Western polemics. Of course, the primary enabling factor in OPEC's price-increasing actions was America's excessive use of oil. How did that come about? U.S. government oil price controls and market interferences gave the wrong signals. Even as oil was becoming scarcer and more expensive globally, it was becoming cheaper here in the United States. Accordingly, we built a society that resided far from work, drove gas-guzzling cars, and lived in energy-consuming homes. The oil industry and others predicted a forthcoming crisis, but Uncle Sam simply was not listening. Regardless of the October 1973 war, oil price shocks were clearly in the works. And how did we respond? Abandoning price controls would have allowed our market to be in sync with world markets, incentivizing the judicious use of oil. Instead, we reluctantly raised price ceilings. By the end of the 1970s, American oil prices were still only 60% of world oil prices. These artificially low prices forced our government to manage the very shortages which its own policies had created. Alas, our management record was pitiful, causing unpredictable and costly economic disruptions. This picture of oil pricing and its consequences was in fact laboratory tested. On January 20, 1981, President Reagan decontrolled oil prices, and oil markets have been totally different ever since. The inflation-adjusted price of oil has been in almost constant decline, consistent decline, for the past two decades. Although we will have, of course, blips from time to time, and we're presently in one of those upward blips. Everything which theory predicted came to fruition, and OPEC has never been the same. Now on to the second assumption, that we are just as vulnerable today, with critics noting rising import dependency ratios. However, that is where the analogies stop. The entire global oil and security environment is different today. As I just noted, American oil and energy pricing as a rule is sane and rational. Markets are allowed to make appropriate adjustments. Second, OPEC in 1975 held 50.67% of world oil output. In the year 2000, it was only 42.82%. And the Cold War is over. Russia is a huge oil exporter and trying to be a U.S. friend. And technological advances have made it cheap, or a lot cheaper, to find, pump, transport, and refine oil. And these advances are going to continue. Further, today we have a strategic petroleum reserve, as do many of our allies. We have an international energy sharing agreement which includes demand restraints during crises. And the Saudis and other Gulf exporters have tasted the good life. Since 1973, the population's expectations have been continuously rising. Alas, Saudi per capita income today is less than half of what it was, far less than half, in 1981. With oil accounting for 90% of foreign exchange earnings, about 75% of government revenues, and 40% of the GDP, they must sell. What are they going to do with the oil? Drink it? Further, the Saudis use oil for political purposes. They buy friends and want the United States as a friend. Indeed, they price their oil at a slight discount to us in order to maintain a significant United States oil market share. Even if we have political differences with the Saudis, as in the current Palestinian-Israeli conundrum, or alleged differences over Iraq, their economic interests will trump their political inclinations. Here again we have laboratory testing. Since 1996, Saddam Hussein has been allowed legal oil sales, and well over 90% come straight here, straight to the United States. Why? He loves us? No. He does it for the money. And we have laboratory testing concerning the resilience of advanced economies. The oil price hikes of 1999 and 2000, coupled with the decline in the value of the euro, imposed upon Germany a crude oil price hike of 211% from the fourth quarter of 1998 through the third quarter of 2000. Nonetheless, economic growth proceeded. Let me now address the third assumption, that the most appropriate way to prevent energy catastrophe is to maintain a military presence in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region. Typical of those with emotional disorders, the United States has undertaken policies likely to bring to fruition our very worst fears. Not only does a permanent troop presence in Saudi Arabia drain resources from more significant national security missions, it provides inspiration to those extremists who wish to topple the Saudi regime. Now, whether the House of Saud is corrupt or courageous, whether it's pious or pitiful, is something that's always subject to debate. But the presence of non-Muslim troops on holy soil, holy Muslim soil, is not. It's a fact, and it makes the Saudis much more of a target. Our national security strategy documents clearly reflect the power of petrol phobia. Bill Clinton's last national security strategy addressed energy security and pointed to, and I quote from the document, our ability to use our naval power if necessary to ensure our access to oil resources, end quote. Our 1999 national security strategy not only stressed access, but it had an implied minimally acceptable price range. I quote, maintaining the free flow of oil at reasonable prices, end quote, as a vital national interest. In short, we are willing to spill American or foreign blood to gain access to a commodity, in this case, somebody else's oil. This is dangerously close to the universally repugnant might makes right doctrine. It is clear evidence of the dominating influence in the American psyche of petrol phobia. Such a policy is not only immoral, it's silly. The domestic and international economy, coupled with adroit policies, are far better tools to get the oil job done. Paraphrasing a recent movie hit, if you demand it, they will come. Now, no one should interpret my words to mean that oil prices cannot or will not go up from time to time. They surely will. But the old economic and energy environment is gone. And there are some obvious policies which can help avert or blunt the impact of supply restrictions and interruptions. In March 1992, a former French minister stated, and I quote, it's hard to take seriously that a nation has deep problems if they can be fixed with a 50-cent a gallon gasoline tax, end quote. 2/3 to 3/4 of the retail gasoline price in Europe is taxes. Here it is 25% to 32%, much lower. Greater taxes at the pump would be a reasoned response to oil supply fears. Filling the strategic petroleum reserve would be a reasoned response. Assisting foreign countries in the development and economic use of their energy resources would be a reasoned choice. There are all sorts of reasoned alternatives. Creative minds will be able to generate many rational alternatives whose costs and benefits must then be weighed. Lastly, let me note that petrol phobia has driven our planners to embrace ridiculous scenarios as realistic possibilities. We act as if Saudi Arabia's 75,000-man National Guard and similar-sized army do not exist. Perhaps they are not the lean, mean fighting machines we would like them to be. But to assume that they have zero capabilities to stop or delay either internal or external threats is ridiculous and certainly doesn't accord with my research and my visits. It is also quite a stretch to assume that the United States would have no lead time intelligence and could not render any useful military assistance except with a permanent in-theater presence. That some of the most far-fetched scenarios are viewed seriously in this town is yet another tribute to petrol phobia's potency. It's high time for us to do some clearer thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don. Our second speaker is Milt Kopulis. He's president of the National Defense Council Foundation. and is a member of the National Petroleum Council, or was a member of the National Petroleum Council, the nation's highest advisory body on matters related to oil and natural gas for a 12-year period. Milt is also a veteran of 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, where he was awarded the Bronze Star and the Army Commendation Medals, among other decorations. Milt.
Good morning. I'm sure you've all heard the old adage that amateur generals study tactics and professionals study logistics. If ever there was a demonstration of the validity of this notion, it's in regard to oil. For more than a century, oil has played an increasingly important role as a military commodity and indeed as a critical military commodity. The ball really started rolling prior to World War I when Winston Churchill began to move British military forces away from coal and towards oil by creating a fast division of battleships. Churchill also was largely responsible for the development of air power and invented the tank, all of which helped create the modern, mechanized military that we take for granted today. Throughout the Second World War, this increased, but today the level of oil required to fulfill military missions has reached a point we would really find hard to imagine. For example, a contemporary heavy armored division, 17,500 men, uses more oil on a daily basis, almost twice as much, in fact, as an entire 200,000-man World War II field army. During the Gulf War, the roughly 450,000 barrels of oil a day consumed by U.S. forces was more than double the amount consumed by the entire Allied expeditionary force that liberated Europe during World War II. In fact, at that point, we were consuming 8 times as much oil per soldier in the field than we did during World War II. And that figure has increased. FM 100-5, which is a basic military document that's their statement of doctrine, has said that in wars of the future, we would see rapid deployments, we would see the movement of troops from the continental United States overseas, and that they would come without warning, without a great deal of lead time. We've seen this demonstrated again and again in recent years in Grenada, in Panama, in Afghanistan, and even to some extent during the Gulf War. But the one thing that has characterized each of these conflicts was the critical importance of oil as a transport fuel. For example, during the Gulf War, 80% of the soldiers that were moved to the Persian Gulf went by air. We were moving 2,400 tons of cargo a day by air. So the importance of oil as a military commodity cannot be understated. Unfortunately, we find in contemporary commentary that very often there's a tendency to confuse the strategic importance, the logistical importance of oil with the source of that oil. And I have to agree that the universe has changed dramatically since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in terms of dependence and the diversity of supply. Yes, it is true that today we are importing somewhere close to 60% of our oil. The figure fluctuates. It was as high as 61 at one point. It's about 57.9 today. But what is different from the times of the various embargoes is that our sources of supply for that oil are quite different. Most Americans assume that it's all coming from the Persian Gulf. The fact is, 3 of the top 4 suppliers of oil to the United States are located in North America. And what we're seeing is, in fact, our top supplier is Canada. The Saudis are second, the third is Mexico. So what we're seeing more and more and more is that we do have sources of supply outside of Saudi Arabia. That doesn't change the fact that the Saudis do sit on top of roughly a quarter of the world's proved oil reserves. So the question is, how important is that? Is it something that we actually need to defend? Well, the question is, what are you defending it against, and what is your fear? Is your fear a supply disruption? The fact is, during World War II, we learned a valuable lesson. It's virtually impossible to destroy an oil field through military strikes. You can disrupt the transport of oil, but repeated bombings of the Plesty oil fields, and this has been proven since that time with action in Iraq, showed us that you can destroy everything on the ground and you don't really do much to what's lying underneath. So the notion of somehow having a force come in and actually damage an oil field is nonsense. Won't happen. The question then is, well, would the Saudis cut us off? And as has just been pointed out, the likelihood that the Saudis would cut us off is diminishingly small. In the early 1970s, during the Arab oil boycott, the Saudis did attempt to reduce supplies, although we never lost more than 4% of our total supplies at any point, as a way of increasing their, as a way of gaining control over the market. They learned a very hard lesson. If you let prices go up too much, people find other alternatives. In fact, between the 1973 boycott and the 1979 embargo, prices had gone up so rapidly and sparked such a growth of alternatives that by October of 1985, the Saudis were only exporting 27,000 barrels a day of oil to the United States. It was then that they learned their second lesson. The way that they can influence and control the market is by keeping prices low. They cut the price in half, and by January of the following year, they were exporting 660,000 barrels a day to the U.S. So the fear that somehow we would see a cutoff of oil that would result in high prices is nonsense. In addition to which, even if they try to target a cutoff, the fact of the matter is that oil would simply shift to a different buyer and we would buy oil from someone else. So the market is oil is a fungible commodity. So the question comes, why are we making this commitment? Why are we concerned about defending Saudi Arabia, maintaining our presence? It's been argued we have to be there in order to defend the oil fields. Well, the fact of the matter is, if we look around the region, we find a rather astounding fact, and that is that Saudi Arabia is the only nation with which we do not have a military cooperation agreement. Our great allies and friends have never been willing to sign one with us. This is not true of Bahrain, it is not true of Oman, it is not true of Kuwait, the UAE. Every other country in the nation has signed a military agreement with us, but not the Saudis, which raises a fundamental question. Why should we defend someone who is unwilling to make the commitment of signing a military agreement? We call them an ally, but by definition, an ally is someone who will come to your defense if you are attacked, and the Saudis have made very clear through word and deed in recent months and weeks that they do not fit this definition. Well, the second issue is, well, okay, but they're very important in the region, and don't we have to maintain their friendship? And I would again say, what friendship is it that we're talking about? Following the 1996 attack on the Khobar Towers, the Saudis refused to cooperate to help find the perpetrators of that assault which killed 19 American service members. If we look at what happened in the wake of the Gulf War, what was the first comment to come out of the Saudi Foreign Minister, Saud al-Faisal? He said the real people being threatened by terrorism are Muslims living in Western countries. They also refused to acknowledge that any of the terrorists were Saudi citizens until finally we beat them over the head with it. And at a more fundamental level, we need to be asking ourselves the question, as the world's leading democracy, and in making this commitment to defend Saudi Arabia and defend the oil fields, this is what we're doing. Should we really be supporting one of the most despotic regimes on the face of the planet? If we look at the history of Saudi Arabia, if we look at how Abd al-Aziz, the founder of the current dynasty, came to power, he came to power on the shoulders of a group called the Ikhwan Brotherhood, which is indistinguishable in ideology and action from the Taliban. And indeed, the philosophy they continue to advocate is virulently anti-Western and virulently anti-American. A final point is that when you look at what is our presence doing, and mind you, we only have 4,500 personnel there at the present time, it's very clear that it is a continuing irritant to Saudi-American relations such as they are. The Saudis simply do not want us there, the rank-and-file Saudis. The leadership wants us there to shore up their position, should it be necessary to have us intervene. In fact, during the Gulf War, the Saudi defense minister was rumored to have referred to U.S. forces as his American mercenaries. But given these facts, and given the fact that our presence may actually be more destabilizing than a calming factor, I have to call into question whether we should be there at all. In the end, the fact is that we have lots of sources of oil, lots of sources outside the Persian Gulf, and indeed Russia is becoming a more and more important prospective ally. The fact is that Saudi Arabia has long played a game of manipulating great powers to their advantage. We are being manipulated today. But what they have also demonstrated in that game is they will turn on an ally in a heartbeat. And I do not think it is in the interest of U.S. security to place so much dependence on an inconstant ally.
Thank you, Milt. Our third speaker is Paul Michael Wiebe. He is a strategic fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study and Political Studies, where he specializes in the study of strategic resources such as oil, natural gas, and water, and their impact on U.S. national security issues, policies. He is also a former vice president of the Federal Liberal Party in Canada during the Trudeau administration. Paul?
Thank you, and good morning. Since the mid-1980s, the United States has been able to significantly moderate global oil pricing through its extraordinary influence over the House of Saud, and by extension, the regulatory mechanism of OPEC. The relationship between a 9 trillion GDP nuclear superpower and a traditional Persian Gulf monarchy whose GDP approximates that of the state of Connecticut, or as one proud Long Islander told me, the county of Nassau, has euphemistically been called a special relationship, or in even more dramatic and romantic terms, an alliance. This glorified characterization of the quality of bilateral affairs between the United States and Saudi Arabia was predicated on the need for cheap, secured sources of crude for the American consumer as a consequence of the domestic political fallout in the aftermath of the 1973 Arab oil embargo. A series of protocols were constructed between the two countries that defined and framed the relationship and have generally fallen under the rubric of oil for security. Or more precisely, in my opinion, cheap, plentiful Saudi oil plus OPEC compliance in exchange for U.S. security assistance in maintaining the House of Saud, who, in turn, would provide an open and friendly market for big-ticket U.S. goods and services on the condition that the Americans would not comment, question, or in any way investigate the internal dynamics of the kingdom or its pursuit of regional security goals, including the purchase of intermediate-range Chinese SS-2 missiles that are now deployed approximately 250 miles southeast of Riyadh, the funding of the Pakistani nuclear program, and the creation of the Wahhabite/Saudi sphere of influences in places like Afghanistan, East Africa, and other places around the globe. The success of this arrangement is evidenced in the bottom line. The average price on a barrel of crude in the 1990s was $19. Retail prices at the gasoline pump depreciated by 50% since 1981, providing the American consumer with a real bargain in comparison to other commodities. After deducting the 40% in taxes on a gallon of gasoline, the cost to the consumer is equal to or less than a gallon of water at your local supermarket. For a number of Saudi constituencies, including elements within the royal family, the massive purchase of U.S. military hardware in the range of approximately $100 billion, the training of its regular and National Guard forces by U.S. advisors and contractors, the granting of rights for U.S. aircraft to use Saudi bases, and eventually the deployment of U.S. forces at Dhahran, Khobar, and the King Khalid and Prince Sultan bases became overt manifestations of the asymmetry of the relationship and would spur resentment, confusion, and hostility to the United States. For the United States, a military presence in Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf deflected Soviet regional ambitions and prevented an Iranian or Iraqi hegemon from developing. However, in the process, it allowed its regional security program, anchored on Saudi Arabia, to be perceived as a Praetorian Guard for the royal family, who used its geopolitical standing as their own private desert shield to ignore eroding social conditions that would eventually fuel the rise of Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda. And simultaneously, they grossly mismanaged the national economy to the point that Saudi Arabia, which has earned approximately, give or take a few $100 billion, $2.5 trillion in oil revenue since 1972. However, now, that mismanagement has made Saudi Arabia a leading debtor nation to the extent of over $200 billion. Its export earnings in constant dollars per capita have declined from $24,000 in 1980 to $2,500 in 2001. And its GDP per capita has collapsed by 70%, from $28,000 in 1981 to less than $7,000 in 2001. In February, Crown Prince Abdullah declared, I quote, "We have noticed that many government bodies are requesting financial allocations outside the budget without consideration to the suffocating crisis that our country is passing through. Experience has taught us that overspending is a bottomless abyss." In December, the government imposed a pay freeze, a hiring freeze, and a cap on state spending. By the 1990s, the U.S. military presence had not only outlived its utility as an indispensable component of U.S. regional security planning, but had become counterproductive to the very purpose for which it was established, namely regional stability. The 1995 and 1996 bombings directed against Americans in Riyadh and at Khobar Towers were warning signals that the U.S. failed to properly assess, primarily because U.S.-Saudi relations had become a Gordian knot of overlapping personal, corporate, and parochial interests that lowered national security calculations to the lowest common denominator. The events of September 11th and leadership from the Bush administration jolted official Washington into action. In January, Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Carl Levin said that the U.S. should transfer U.S. aircraft and personnel and assets from the Prince Sultan Air Base after visiting the region and consulting with the Saudis. In February, the Boston Globe reported on a classified CIA report commissioned by the Directorate of Intelligence, which depicted the House of Saud as a fragile monarchy facing instability in the long run. And although the document did not predict a near-term crisis, it painted a picture of the monarchy as dangerously isolated and expressed serious concerns about long-term stability. In March, the Department of Defense did not include Saudi Arabia on its list of allies in the war against terrorism. And just last month, the Department of Energy issued a new report downgrading Saudi Arabia as a secure source of oil. The report said a combination of extremely unlikely conditions in 2002 will provide Saudi Arabia with, let me repeat that, in sum, quoting from the report, in sum, Saudi Arabia has to face a serious deterioration in its finances and its economic situation in 2002, and possibly for several years to come, after 2 years of relative abundance. As recently as yesterday, news reports from Saudi Arabia indicated that the United States was indeed transferring its from its headquarters at Prince Sultan base south of Riyadh to a new base near Doha in Qatar. So even as we speak, the military presence in Saudi Arabia seems to be coming to an end. Responding to this emerging reality, Crown Prince Abdullah has begun to confront the establishment of radical Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, as well as his rivals within the royal family. In my opinion, the Bush administration has recognized that the requirements to sustain inexpensive crude to fuel the American economy no longer includes a U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, nor even influence in OPEC deliberations through a Saudi proxy. I believe this administration is beginning to understand that a new global energy pattern has emerged over the last decade that makes the traditional relationship with Saudi Arabia and even the Persian Gulf as a whole redundant. Indeed, the United States receives less than 4% of its total energy requirements from the Persian Gulf. New technologies, new markets, and lots of oil from producers in Russia, Canada, Africa, South America, and the Caspian Basin will provide reliable sources of crude to meet American demands. And as was said earlier, this year, in 2002, Russia will surpass Saudi Arabia as the largest producer of oil in the world. In all probability, the Russians will produce 8 million barrels of oil this year, as opposed to the Saudi production of 7 million barrels. And of course, when you add to that the Caspian Basin production of an additional 500 to 600,000 barrels, we see that the former Soviet Union will be producing well over 1 million barrels of oil beyond what the Saudis are now committed to. Canada, for the first time in 2002, will produce over 3 million barrels a day. Even new regulatory mechanisms to manage oil price and supply are likely to emerge in the near future, reducing even further OPEC's already diminished role as a dominant supplier and price fixer. Indeed, OPEC's share in world oil production has declined from 1975, where it had a share of 50%, to 2002, where its share will be 35%. Saudi production share in 1980 was 17% world production. In 2001, it is 11%. In sum, the U.S. military departure from Saudi Arabia represents an abandonment of the fossilized assumptions that the Persian Gulf is the epicenter of our energy security policy, and that the maintenance of the Saudi regime in its current form is a prerequisite for regional stability. New assumptions based on a realistic assessment of local conditions, energy trend lines, new war-fighting capabilities, and the application of American power will form the basis of a new regional architecture that may, under certain conditions, eventually include Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our final speaker, but not the last word, is going to be from Jerry Taylor, who's my colleague at Cato as the Director of Natural Resource Studies. Jerry?
Thank you, Bill. There's an old saying about the fellow who went to who said, "I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out." Well, this morning I feel sort of the same way. I came to a debate and a cocktail party broke out. I find very little to disagree with from the previous three speakers. All I can really do is to underscore certain observations, provide asterisks on others, and fill in the gaps where I think a bit more commentary would be useful. But let's begin at the beginning. There has long been this underlying belief. In fact, it dates back 35 years, and we heard a variation of it from Mr. Wiebe just a moment ago, that America has maintained relatively stable and moderate prices because of the special relationship we've had with the Saudis. In other words, we have had to bribe them to some degree, either with U.S. military protection or a less pro-Israeli foreign policy might otherwise take in order to ensure that the oil flowed. And Mr. Wiebe pointed out, well, you can see the fruits of that policy, that special relationship. Since the mid-1980s, prices have come down. They've been relatively stable and moderate until recently. And this gives you an example of the fruits of this special relationship we've had with the Saudis. My asterisk to that statement is that this has been a self-serving myth promoted by OPEC from the very beginning. It is the fundamental misunderstanding about oil markets that animates a tremendous amount of policy confusion. The fact is that OPEC nations, each and every last one of them, are profit maximizers. You cannot understand OPEC production behavior or pricing behavior without understanding profits. Maury Edelman, a very prominent oil economist, has written much about this, and he said he can't find, in the course of 35 years, a single instance in which an OPEC nation ever left money on the table to pursue some sort of political end. And to dwell back with what Mr. Wiebe had argued, what happened to our special relationship with the Saudis, which was every bit as much there, allegedly, in the 1970s? This special relationship didn't begin in 1986 when oil prices undertook their epic collapse. This special relationship allegedly existed from the very beginning of OPEC, and in fact all through the 1967 and 1973 oil embargoes and the production cutbacks in the 1970s. Well, the special relationship in a quarter would have bought you a cup of coffee. The special relationship that Saudi Arabia had with us allegedly bought us, well, price hikes and embargoes and the rest of it. Saudi Arabia told us that we were lucky they were producing any oil whatsoever, since they were doing a favor by keeping oil in the refineries and not in the ground when it would be more valuable down the road. This was economic nonsense, but it was nonsense that we believed. Of course, it serves OPEC's purpose to have us believe that they do us favors by selling us oil. What they buy for that is not only a lot more foreign policy consideration than these economies would otherwise warrant, but it also buys them military protection and other sorts of things from the United States government. But the fact is there's never been any correlation between OPEC price hawks and price doves and how those members felt about the United States or about the industrialized West. For instance, when the Ayatollah Khomeini knocked off the Shah in 1979, the oil kept flowing. When U.S. bombs rained down on Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 1986, the oil kept flowing. And of course, we had to impose an embargo on Saddam Hussein to get him to stop selling oil into the world market. So the idea that somehow we need to have warm, fuzzy, and nice relations with OPEC nations to receive oil in the world market has always been a self-serving myth that has served OPEC's purposes and not the United States' purposes. Now, would Saudi Arabia become more vulnerable to outside aggressors, say Iraq, if it were not for the U.S. military presence? Of course, that has been one of the main arguments for keeping the U.S. military there. The first argument, of course, is that this is just part of the bribe. The second, of course, is our interest to make sure that some lunatic doesn't take control of the Saudi oil fields. Well, that begs the question. The United States military wasn't there. What would Saudi Arabia do with its money and with its time? Well, the Saudis and the rest of OPEC paid for the overwhelming majority of the costs of Operation Desert Storm. They're obviously capable of defending themselves if necessary. They'll take the free defense help, at least until recently they take the free defense help. But the idea that the United States military is the thin blue line between every lunatic aggressor with a couple of machine guns in the Saudi oil fields, I think, is silly. It's simply a welfare program, a wealth transfer to the Middle Eastern oil producers from the United States taxpayer, under, in my opinion, very dubious rationales. Now, the second point I'd like to make is something that, to underscore something Don Losman said, that cutbacks are probably not in OPEC's best interest right now, production cutbacks. And the main reason, as Don mentioned, is that oil revenues are really all these governments have. If it weren't for the oil revenues that OPEC received, they would be about as important in the global economy and the global political world as, say, Uganda or some other nation that we pay very little attention to. Oil is the only reason we care about what the Arab Street thinks. It's the only reason why we have ambassadors there who worry about what princes and other monarchists have to say to us. And it's the only reason we worry too much about the conflict in the Middle East. If were it not for this particular fact, I assume American foreign policy would probably be somewhat quite different. But the fact is that a major cutback in OPEC production would probably do far more harm to the producers than the consumers. As Don pointed out, the oil checks that flow to Saudi citizens once stood at around $22,000 per person. In 1980, they now stand at about $6,500, and they're going down, and that's one of the main causes of instability in those regimes. And it's not for nothing that captured tapes from al-Qaeda have been reported to include exhortations from Osama bin Laden for his sympathizers to leave the Saudi oil fields alone because, quote, the oil is the source of Arab power. And it certainly is. So the idea that the main source of Arab power would be taken off the table by the Arabs themselves, in my opinion, is relatively silly. But what if I'm wrong? What would be the consequences of a major cutback in the Middle East? Well, we don't have to speculate. We can actually do a little bit of math about this. It turns out that in the short run, as oil economists know, the relationship between supply and price in oil markets is about 0.1. That is, a 1% reduction in supplies induces about a 10% increase in price in the short run. It's important. In the long run, it doesn't work that way, but in the short run, it does. That means markets, of course, are very vulnerable to minor supply cutbacks, which can send prices careening. Now, in the Middle East today, OPEC, Middle Eastern producers account for about 30% of the world oil market, while Saudi Arabia accounts for about 12% of the world market. So a complete Saudi shutdown then would jack prices about 120% to somewhere around $50 a barrel, while a Middle Eastern shutdown would shoot prices up to around $85 a barrel. In the short run. In the long run, those prices would not stay that high. But for those who think such prices are absolutely unimaginable, today, of course, they're about $28 a barrel, think again. We've already experienced them. The average cost of crude oil in 1981 was $35 in 1981 dollars, but adjusted for inflation, and we're at around $60 a barrel for 1981 oil. So in other words, we've already been in a world, figuratively, where Saudi production would disappear. Nobody looks back at 1981 as a time of economic robustness and fond memories, but it was not a world which destroyed the United States or the industrialized West. To be sure, again, we don't have very many good memories of that, but the fact is we could indeed survive those kind of prices. We've done it before. A newest concern has now come back to haunt us, that's the concern of the embargo. As you probably saw, Iraq announced the other day that it would support a new oil embargo on the United States, and Iran, ever that lovely nation, argued that they too would consider such a thing if it were put on an OPEC agenda at the next meeting. The problem is, of course, is a lot of people have such an amazing fear of embargoes that they will do virtually anything to avoid them. But I think this, again, misunderstands the lessons of the 1970s. As has been pointed out by several speakers, all that occurs during an embargo, all that occurred in the 1973 embargo, for example, was the United States was no longer able to buy oil directly from OPEC producers. The United States ended up buying oil from people who bought oil from OPEC producers, or simply shifted purchases to non-OPEC sources, and those non-OPEC sources who had once supplied Europe and other nations decided to supply the United States with that oil, and the nations who were cut off from the non-OPEC sources went to the OPEC sources. There was simply an annoying reshuffling of supply transaction, but at the end of the day, during 1973, there was absolutely no reduction in the amount of imports of oil coming into United States ports. In fact, many people forget this was not the very first oil embargo. The first oil embargo was in 1967, and it was rapidly announced and then eliminated, but because it had no effect. In 1967, the OPEC Secretary General at the time said, there just isn't any effective selective embargo that we could impose. After the 1973 embargo, Saudi Oil Minister Sheikh Yamani conceded the same thing. He said the 73 embargo, quote, did not imply that we could reduce imports to the United States. The world is really just one market, so the embargo was more symbolic than anything else, unquote. So, How then do we explain those oil prices? The reason why we think about the 73 embargo, not the 67 embargo, of course, is because oil prices went up, gas lines started up, and people associate that with the embargo. Well, if embargoes could do such things, why didn't they do such things in 1967? And one of the main reasons is that in 1973, the oil embargo coincided with some really bad domestic policy in the United States. In brief, Nixon's price controls restricted the ability of multinational oil companies to import oil from abroad and then sell it at cost here at home. The price control regime basically made it unprofitable for oil companies to bring in imports. So what did they do? They stopped importing oil, or they cut back on imports dramatically. What did that do? Well, it starved the United States of oil right at the time this embargo was beginning to take hold. And that reduced amount of oil ended up cutting off independent service stations. The vertically integrated oil companies would supply their own stations. They didn't have the excess oil to supply the independents. So the independents ran out of oil, and people were very upset about multinationals for doing all kinds of things to consumers, when in reality they were only trying to save their economic necks. And then from that, spiraling on additional price control regimes, which most oil economists blame for the gas lines and for most of the high prices. As a matter of fact, in 1973, no other nation experienced the gas lines the United States did, even though all of them were a part of the same world oil market. So again, it was not so much the embargo in 73 that had to do with any of this. We know that it didn't reduce imports to the United States. They were domestic policies. It just so happened those domestic policies coincided with embargo and underwrote our fears. Finally, some have argued that, well, better safe than sorry. It's best to just not rely so much on foreign oil, Saudi oil in particular. Iraqi oil, of course, if you listen to Dan Murkowski, is uniquely odious, that we need to increase our reliance on domestic oil, so we just don't have to worry about OPEC manipulations of domestic price. Now, if you've taken any economics classes, you'll know immediately the problem with this argument. Oil is a fungible global commodity. Even if the United States got all of its oil from Texas, every last drop of it, and even if it came from an oil well that George Bush owned, it really wouldn't matter much, because if OPEC cut back production, it would drive world prices high, and it would drive West Texas crude prices just as high as it would drive Kuwaiti crude prices, even if we weren't buying from OPEC. And we do, again, have a test case of this. We've run the experiment, as Don Lozman puts it. In 1979, Great Britain was energy independent. It had reached that holy grail of oil economics. All of its oil came from the North Sea. They weren't importing any OPEC oil. Supposedly, they were less vulnerable to OPEC's market manipulations than, say, Japan, which was entirely dependent on oil imports. But the Iranian Revolution and the cutbacks in production that occurred in 79 drove up North Sea crude just as high as it drove up the price of Kuwaiti crude, and British consumers on the wholesale market were facing the same prices that Japanese consumers were facing, even though the British consumers were entirely energy independent, whereas the Japanese consumers were entirely energy dependent. The moral from all this is that we don't need to worry anywhere near as much as we do about foreign oil. One, it will always be there for us. The only way an OPEC nation could launch an embargo that would keep it from us is if they built a deep sea navy and embargoed our ports. And of course, that is not on the horizon quite yet. Major cutbacks would harm OPEC more than they would harm the United States. We've been able to survive those prices in the past. And as has been pointed out by several speakers, the ability of OPEC to maintain those sorts of high prices, even in the short run, is far greater attenuated now than it has been in the past, given the rise of Russia in the world oil markets. Today, few people realize, as I think was pointed out earlier, Russia is a larger oil producer than is Saudi Arabia today. They are the #2 oil exporter, and the only reason they're not the #1 oil exporter is because they have had a very poor infrastructure for delivery of their oil to global markets. With billions of dollars pouring into that sector, Ed Morse and a few other energy specialists think that the Russians will probably become the #1 oil exporter on the planet by 2003, 2004, and that's probably accurate. That's not to say that Russia has as many reserves as the Saudi does. They don't. But the fact is that Saudi Arabia's ability to manipulate oil markets was largely dependent upon their ability to win price wars against all comers if need be. That was their ability. That was the way they maintained price. I don't think they'll have that ability to any degree or anywhere near the degree they've had in the past in the present. So the bottom line is it's nice to have Saudi oil. Saudi Arabia is an important player in the world economy, in the global oil market. But the idea that the only way we get that oil is by bribing them through foreign policy, bribing them through military aid, or by playing nice with them and taking the Saudi party line on various policy issues, in my opinion, is a self-serving myth promoted by Saudi Arabia and the rest of OPEC nations that America should outgrow and learn to get over. Thank you very much.
I'm pleased that the presentations by our four speakers will have the effect of making my views look moderate. In the winter of 1991, during the Desert Shield period, and prior to the Desert Storm war against Iraq, Cato held a conference addressing the question of whether the United States should proceed from the defense of Saudi Arabia to the question of restoring the Al-Sabah family as rulers of Kuwait. And at that conference, I presented a paper called Oil is Not Worth a War. And the case that I made there is very much the same case as being made here now. There is no way for Saudi Arabia or any other of the Middle Eastern countries to selectively embargo the United States. Whether they sell us oil directly or not is really quite irrelevant, because we'll either buy the oil that was intended for some other party, or buy oil from other parties. The only way that the Middle East can affect American consumers is if they absolutely cut back the level of production, and the evidence is that that is more of a sacrificial act by the Middle Eastern powers than they have been able to sustain. Now, there are some potential concerns about the political position in the Middle East that are related to oil, but are not directly a consequence of the effects of actions over there on the price of oil. One is that we may not be indifferent to the distribution of wealth in the Middle East, but I find it very difficult to get excited about that as to whether the House of Saud gets most of the money from the Saudi fields or Saddam Hussein. Now, it may be that that's a problem, in the sense that we may not want Saddam Hussein to have the extra money to spend rather than the House of Saud, but I regard both of them as being unattractive regimes, and it's hard to get very exercised about making the case that the American presence over there is to make sure that the House of Saud continues to get the net rents from oil rather than some other party in the Middle East. Another concern that has become more credible in recent months is that we would not want somebody to control the oil fields over there who is genuinely self-sacrificial, somebody who is prepared to forego the oil revenues in order to harm the West. As I say, there's no way to harm the United States in particular. But there is a way to harm the West, and that's to shut off production and to destroy possibly the transportation facilities and the above-ground facilities. It's a shutting off production, which would be self-sacrificial on their part, but there may be potential regimes in the Middle East that may be willing to do that. I don't think that that's the case. As has been mentioned, even Osama bin Laden has said we would not do that, because oil is the wealth of the Arab states. Now, that I think is not a serious concern, but it is something that we do have to address. In some sense, we're rather better protected by regimes that clearly want to maximize their revenues from oil than by regimes that might be prepared to make substantial sacrifices on their own part in order to harm the rest of the world, as it would turn out, whether it's Japan or the United States, it would harm the rest of the world. Again, to go back to my original statement, there's no way to selectively embargo the United States. And my conclusion at the time, I think, is my conclusion at the present time. Oil is not worth a war. In fact, a war over there is much more likely to be disruptive of oil than the absence of war. A war is likely to lead one or other parties, either ourselves or other parties, to destroy some of the above-ground oil facilities and transportation facilities, as Saddam Hussein did when he left Kuwait. And leaving Kuwait, he destroyed, for a period of time, the physical facilities to get the oil out of Kuwait. And a war is much more likely to provoke that kind of behavior than the absence of war. And also, particularly if the objective of the war is to replace the regime A regime whose existence is at stake in the war is much more likely to be self-sacrificial and destructive than one that whose existence is not at stake. So again, my conclusion is that oil is not worth the war. It was not worth the war in 1991. I think it is not worth the war at the present time. I think the major question that all of us have to address is the charge that the reason that the real price of oil has dropped now more or less continuously since 1981 is a consequence of the policies that we've had in place during that period of time. Policies that have supported the House of Saud, policies that now, since the Gulf War, include U.S. military forces in Saudi Arabia, policies that have involved are other dimensions of our role in the Middle East. That's the major question I think that we all need to address and to make clear, because we have to, if we think that our policies over there are misguided, we have to make it clear that the fact that we've had relative success in reducing the real price of oil now for a 20-year period, we have to parse out whether that economic benefit, that economic outcome, is in part a consequence of our policy over there or despite our policy. Now, would any of the four speakers like to respond to remarks by the other speakers?
I would like to make one brief comment vis-a-vis Soviet resources and Saudi resources. In 1987, the Department of Energy had asked me to do a review of the Soviet Union, now Russia's, oil resource base. And one of the rather astounding things we discovered in examining them is that when you take into consideration oil that's left into the ground because of both a limitation on funding for tertiary oil recovery as well as not perhaps the best drilling crews, not to offend our new Russian friends in the world, the actual size of the Russian resource base as opposed to the proved reserves is significantly larger than has been reported. When you take into account the potential of the Caspian Sea as well, while it's not as easy to produce Russian oil, you may find that the resource base there is much larger than has been reported. And you know what I quite frankly feel we should do whatever we can to ensure that there are no barriers to investment in Russia, especially in that sector, because over the long term I feel they'd be a much more secure source of supply than Saudi Arabia will be.
A good point, Milt. I'm intrigued that those of us who've been Cold Warriors for many years continue to use the word Soviet when we describe the conditions in what is now Russia and the various stands. Jerry?
Well, I'll respond to a point you made, Bill, and maybe just elaborate on it a bit. This argument that the decline in price since 1981 and the dramatic collapse in 86 having to do with our relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think completely misunderstands world oil markets. One of the most interesting things about the work that Professor Maury Edelman has produced at MIT is the observation that all throughout the 70s, there was virtually no reduction in supply on the world oil market. You would think, given these tremendous price spikes that we experienced in the 70s, that we were being starved for oil by production cutbacks in the Middle East. It's not true. What was driving those prices were largely fear of future dearth. If you remember back in the 70s, you had not only Paul Ehrlich and others arguing that the oil was about to run out, that there was a very limited resource base and we'd be facing $100 prices for a barrel of oil in the year 2000. But you had the Department of Energy making the same predictions, the Energy Information Administration making the same predictions, and many oil companies making the same predictions, and the vast majority of energy economists making the same predictions. Now, given all of that, it's easy to see why stock inventory buildup was going on tremendously throughout the 1970s, because everyone thought that even though it only cost the Saudis 50 cents to produce a barrel of oil, they're doing us a favor by selling it at $22, given the fact they'll be selling for $100 in only 10 years. And so there was a tremendous demand for oil, a tremendous increase in demand, not only from the economy, but because of fear of future dearth. When that fear broke in the early 1980s, the entire price bubble collapsed along with it in an epic manner. Not only had inventories been built up, but it began to dawn on people there was far more non-OPEC oil available than had previously been believed. It also began to dawn on people that with the emergence of spot prices and futures markets, that suppliers were able to hedge against the risk of future dearth without holding extensive inventory. And that, combined with the elimination of price controls in the United States, just completely slaughtered the speculative bubble. And since that time, OPEC's main job has been keeping prices up, not holding prices down. So I think you can explain the movement of oil prices in world oil markets without repairing to the idea that someone's cutting us a deal or a favor by playing prices one way or the other. Markets actually work, even given the OPEC cartel. And I think that explains things far better than any other alternative explanation.
Questions from the floor. Please raise your hand, wait for the mic, identify yourself, and address your question to a particular member of the panel. Here.
Yes, I'm curious as to the future outlook for oil prices in an environment in which, assuming stability of oil prices, increasing demand, new finds and development of production, what's the future over a 20 or 30-year period?
Well, I'm glad you said 20 or 30-year period, because no one can tell you authoritatively what's going to happen in the near term. That's just, if I could do that well, I'd be making a lot of money in the futures market, and that's not my job. One thing we know is that oil prices are extremely volatile. If you were to take a look at a chart or a graph and see the movement of prices over time, it'd be extremely variable with peaks and valleys. They move up and they move down, and we've seen prices going into the mid-30s over very minor supply disruptions. We've seen them drop to 10 only a few years ago with only minor reductions in demand. So they do move around. But the general trajectory of oil prices over the past 100 years has been, even adjusting for the volatility, downward. And the main reason is that technology continues to advance at a breathtaking pace, which allows us to recover non-economic sources and make them economic with horizontal drilling, with advances in computerization, which allows us to hit a live one when we drill for wells at a far, far greater accuracy rate than we could in the past. I think that'll continue. I'm not worried about a long-term reduction in supply. And in fact, I had a conversation with Carl Pope, who's the president of the Sierra Club, just a few weeks ago about this very subject. And he agreed that environmentalists and the resource depletionists like Ehrlich and the rest, and Robert Heilbronner and others, fundamentally got it wrong in the 60s and 70s, and that even Carl, who's a alarmist on a lot of environmental resource issues, would agree that the long-term picture for oil is declining, not increasing price. So if that convinces Carl, I think that's fairly dispositive.
I'd also like to add one point to that, and that is that in Resource Economics 101, one of the things they teach you is that the long-term trend line for all commodities is down. And if you look at every commodity throughout history, what you find is that holds true. It is just as true for oil as it was for anything else.
Could I just piggyback on that? And that I agree perfectly with this, but it doesn't mean necessarily your price at the pump is going to go down, because I think the price of crude is about 35% of the price that we pay at retail. And there are other factors, such as I don't think we've built a new refinery in a long period of time, so if there's a fire or a stoppage or anything like that, or depending upon various environmental regulations where gasoline that may be in short supply in one area of the country isn't allowed to be sold in another, it has to be a different grade in another section. So we may see at the retail level, some spikes due to things that have nothing to do with crude whatsoever.
Yes, here.
Just, it seems to me that the cocktail party.
Will you identify yourself, please?
Dan Kuda from Institute for Defense Analyses. It seemed like a lot of the argument from the panel had been fairly straightforward and centered on unilateral U.S. policy and economics. But I wonder if the panel could just talk to the issue of global order. And certainly a Cato formula in the past has been a balancer of last resort. Is there not some argument, some merit on the basis of global order of at least some U.S. presence in the Mideast to stabilize things, more than just what the economic markets would allow for long-term stability?
Well, I think you have to begin by distinguishing between the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and the extent to which we actually lend stability. In the case of Saudi Arabia, I would argue that our presence is creating instability. The fact is the Saudis don't like us, don't want us. There was a brief mention made of Wahhabism as though that were, and we have to understand that is not a recent development. It was the way in which the current dynasty, which traces its illustrious lineage almost 2 generations, came to power at the turn of the century. The fact is it is virulently anti-Western, and the rank and file, the average person outside the royal family, does not like us there, does not want us there. So we may be more an irritant. The other thing is that with only 4,500 people there to begin with, it's not as though we have a massive presence. We are already, it would appear, moving out some of the heavy equipment. And remember, we have a big base in Dohar. We have bases in Qatar. We've got bases in Kuwait. We actually have a fairly substantial land base in Kuwait, which, if you're going against Iraq, is physically closer than the Saudis. And quite frankly, one of the things that hasn't been mentioned here is that perhaps what we need to do in looking at the region is to focus on the few people who really are allies. Clearly, the strongest ally in the region is Turkey. From which, we have to fly the overflights of Iraq from Turkey because the Saudis won't let us. They're the only ones that have actually committed ground forces in Afghanistan, and they never seem to enter into the discussion of this topic.
To respond to your, I think, very important, timely question, we have entered a new era after September 11th. The interregnum of the post-Cold War period is over. There is a need for a new global order, and we see this in the negotiations between the United States and Russia over NATO membership. We see it in the call by Margaret Thatcher that Britain should consider leaving the EU. We see it in the formulation of a North American energy grid system built on the foundations of NAFTA. The Middle East needs to be addressed. The United States and official Washington, including policy institutes like Cato, are looking at a new regional order and new definitions of that regional order. We need to start discussing, debating the issue of a greater Middle East above and beyond the narrow confines of the Persian Gulf or the Arab world per se. We need to look at the role of Turkey as a dominant regional power. Indeed, as my colleague has said, Turkey now is taking the lead and command of forces in Afghanistan. It is supporting the United States operations in Georgia, and it is a key player in the possible new policy to Iraq. We need to look at Iraq as a new entity with a possibility of a moderate pro-Western government. Will that new Iraq provide the United States with a new partner in the region, facilitating increased oil supply, facilitating a new market for the United States, facilitating bases for U.S. military personnel? We need to look at a restructuring of the Palestinian-Israeli agenda and the issues that Donald Rumsfeld has put forward regarding Iran and Syria. So the entire region is in play. And we have an option to secure a new regional order based on certain values driven by certain interests. And if we don't address this forcefully and in a coherent way, there's another map out there. There's a Wahhabite map for the region. There's a Russian map for the region. This is an area that since time immemorial has been inherently unstable. And traditionally the response to that instability has been empire and hegemon. And we need to learn those lessons of history and apply them to the circumstances of the modern era.
May I remind you that the second panel this morning is going to address these questions of political order, and specifically the question of whether our presence in Saudi Arabia increases or reduces our own security interests. Yes, in the back.
Irv Chapman, question carrying on this issue of foreign policy and the allegations that have been made that looking over the American shoulder at the oil producers skews policy toward Israel and the Palestinians. What would that policy, or what should it be, if we were not looking over the petro shoulder?
I'm sure everyone has a different opinion about what it would be. I'm sure all of us also have an opinion about what it ought to be. My own take on this is that the United States considers this Palestinian-Israeli fight to be of far more importance than the Hutu-Tutsi fight based on the fact there's oil in the region. Were it not for oil in the region, then I'm not sure why it is instability in one part of the globe is so obviously and dramatically more important than instability in other parts of the globe, particularly when, if you just do body counts, you don't see necessarily why the world will be so transfixed with, say, one and not the other. I think that the presence of this valuable commodity under the sand makes all the difference in the industrialized world. I do know that when it comes to European positions on the war, again, I keep going back to Maury Edelman because his book, for those of you interested, titled Genie Out of the Bottle, World Oil Prices Since 1970, is an absolutely invaluable history of world oil markets and OPEC. But in his book, Maury Edelman, time and time again, cites stories in the New York Times and the various trade press, which has European ministers, French and British and German and Italian foreign ministers, over and over again conceding and asserting that and because of the need to have a special relationship with OPEC oil producers, and because of their fear that without this special relationship their economies would be put at risk, they have taken a pro-Arab tilt. Now, over time, of course, there's probably evolving reasons for this position, but at the inception, the worry for oil certainly animated and helped dramatically inform European public policy. That to me was a striking conclusion of that book.
I think it's also fair to say on more than one occasion that same concern has influenced U.S. policy, most notably during the Lebanese incursion, where we actually forced Israel to withdraw its forces when they'd gotten to the Beirut-Damascus road, stand in place for 24 hours, which allowed the Syrians to bring up their heavy armor, and as a result, the Israelis suffered very heavy casualties to recapture ground they had taken virtually without losing a man.
Let me just, if I can, just suggest that I think, as Paul sort of mentioned, and as we all should know by now, the Middle East is so rife with its own inherent instabilities, hatreds, rivalries, ethnic, national, tribal, family, and so forth. I think we have to be very, very, very careful and very conservative in whatever we do in the region. And I think the panel, maybe surprisingly, singing the same song, is that we don't have to make major commitments because of oil. And that relieves me. I wish more people would think that way, because it's a dangerous region. No matter what you do, it's the old damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. So I think we need to be very conservative and standoffish where possible.
I think we should also recognize that the number of foreign service jobs available in Arab and Muslim countries is much higher than assignments to Israel. And I think that biases the position of the Foreign Service in the United States and Britain and most of the European countries. A question here, yes.
Yes, my name is Robert Heiler. I work at IASPS with Mr. Wibby. Mr. Niskanen, I had a question for you with respect to the issue that you raised about a genuinely self-sacrificial regime coming to power in the region. Given that that the stability of the House of Saud right now is being questioned in some cases, say, for example, that such a regime were to come to power. Say Bin Laden were able to return in the way that the Ayatollah returned to Iran and take over the Saudi oil fields. What would be his level or that regime's level of stability, given the economic conditions? We've heard that the GDP per capita is 70% lower than it was 20 years ago there. A self-sacrificial regime would certainly not make that situation any better, would in fact make it much worse. What would be the internal political ramifications to such a regime from which would also be Wahhabite or some other very extreme version, ideologically speaking, and would that regime be able to stay in power very long? I guess I'd like maybe all of the panelists to comment on that.
Well, I think one thing you need to do is look at what actually happened in Iran following the Ayatollah, and I think you'll see a similar consequence. You would see a similar consequence, and I don't necessarily accept that the House of Saud is all that shaky. Quite frankly, they're past masters at manipulating their own populace as well as great powers. But what you saw happen in Iran was that the technocrats, and Saudi Arabia has a whole class of technocrats that have grown up, left. The reason you saw a decline in Iranian oil production was not through intent. It was through stupidity. They didn't have anybody who could operate a lot of the equipment, and those who remained behind had a tendency to fix things with a sledgehammer, which usually doesn't work very well. In fact, they did try to continue to produce oil. There was never any intentional reduction. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the production of oil there happens to be a lot easier than it is anywhere else in the world. However, they also have some very, very highly sophisticated, often one-of-a-kind equipment. At Ras Tanura, there's a loading terminal that has ball bearings that are in some parts of it that are 6 feet across, and nobody else has anything like that. So you could see some temporary disruptions of production, not through any intent, but just through error. That I don't think would last very long, because again, they need the money to survive. The fact is that the Saudis discovered in the 80s that the market clearing point for their oil was about $10 a barrel in 1980 dollars. And if you take a look at what they've done ever since, is they have tried to maintain the price at about that level ever since.
Any more questions? Yes. Go ahead.
I don't know. Okay. I just wanted to.
Yeah, sure.
One other comment about our involvement there. If we are not there with a military presence, and if there are some serious instabilities, our being there enables this free rider situation where the Europeans are more heavily dependent upon oil from that region, and the oil producers themselves, of course, have to get it out. Our being there absolves them of the moral and the financial responsibilities of doing it themselves. If we are not there, in all probability, if there are serious threats, I would suspect people in the region, we talk about maybe the mining the Straits of Hormuz and things like that, would probably undertake some very substantial efforts to make sure that that didn't happen, which I think they are doing, by the way. Because it would redound not only to them negatively economically, but disproportionately, because shipping premiums and things like that would go up for their oil as opposed to oil coming from other places. So I think that's another reason why we really have to think about our involvement very carefully.
Since we're winding down, let me just use that question to underscore a point I made in my presentation. Imagine the worst-case scenario of a self-sacrificial series of regimes shutting down production in the Middle East across the board. This is the nightmare scenario. Well, what would happen? The first thing that would happen is that we would find ourselves in a world, in the short term, in a world of oil prices only a bit north of prices circa 1981. This is not economic Armageddon. It's a bad thing. It would be detrimental to the global economy. Consumers wouldn't care for it. But we've been there and we've survived that. So it's not exactly as if the oil weapon were some nuclear bomb that could be used to destroy Western civilization. That's just simply not true. Second, any reason to worry about Arab military power disappears in a flash. If you want to know what the Saudi economy would look like absent oil revenue, go to Karachi. That's what it would look like. There's absolutely no, it's 3/4 of the revenue of the House of Saud. They have absolutely nothing else of economic value to offer in the world markets. What's striking to me is given the trillions of dollars of oil revenue that's been earned in Saudi Arabia, like any other command and control economy, they've completely thrown it away and they've had virtually nothing to show for it except expensive palaces that get dismantled the day they launch that kind of economic cutback. Third, there would probably be incredible instability in these countries. Again, one of the main reasons of instability is a lot of people grew spoiled in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and elsewhere, living off the oil dole, a dole which is now disappearing rapidly. For all protestations to the contrary, there is not a major movement in Saudi Arabia to return the country to camels and tents, which is what would occur. And then fourth, that whatever military bad guy were in power that we would worry about would find his ability to prosecute his war against the West would disappear in a flash. In other words, there would be no money to fund terrorism, no money to fund military training camps, no money to defend the military, no money, in a sense, to defend themselves against what my hunch would be an incredibly hostile developed world who now seriously think about things we don't think about very much, like direct military action. So it's all these things are, of course, possible, but they seem to be rather implausible in strategies that I think would be self-defeating for the self-sacrificer.
Well, against my usual better judgment, I'm going to give Jerry the last word. But please thank Don and Milt and Paul and Jerry for a good presentation. We'll reconvene here promptly at 10:45 for the second panel.